Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. Before we begin, can I just say, if you enjoyed this video, do please give it a like or a thumbs up, and if you haven't already done so, then do please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this one or stories about the history of the Northeast. Please also feel free to share this video if you think others might enjoy it too. Thank you. Joseph William Noble was found guilty of the murder of John Patterson at Windy Nook in Gateshead in 1907. Was it a planned murder or was it simply a robbery gone wrong? I will let you decide. This is his story. Joseph William Noble was born in Stannington near Morpeth in around 1860 to parents William and Mary. He came from a relatively large family with 8 known brothers and sisters. He married Elizabeth, whose surname was possibly Johnson, in around 1891 in Newcastle upon Tyne, and they had 3 known children together, 2 boys and a girl. By 1901 he was listed as living at Stone Street in Windy Nook with 2 of his children. He was a blacksmith and worked for the North Eastern Railway Company at the locomotive works in Gateshead. John Patterson, the victim, was born in around 1874 in Windy Nook in Gateshead to parents John and Mary. John came from a very large family with around 14 or 15 brothers and sisters, but they also seemed to be a sadly unlucky family, with 4 of his brothers and sisters dying in 1870 in the month of December under the age of 8 years. I think this may have been during the smallpox pandemic, and several more of his brothers and sisters died in infancy too. In 1899, John married Hannah Hardy and they had 2 known children together. In 1901, he is listed as living in the Heworth area and is a quarryman, and he is also a committee member of the local cooperative society. The Co-op stores in Windy Nook, this is said to have been on the corner of Union Street and Howard Street, which is no longer there, was suffering from regular thefts of meat and other items, and the Co-op committee felt this may be an inside job as there were no signs of forced entry at any time. However, they did not want to involve the police, so they decided to place their own watchmen on the premises overnight in the hope of catching the culprit red-handed. These would usually be committee men. They had done this for a couple of nights and nothing had happened until the early morning of November the 1st, 1907. On the evening before the crime was committed, the manager of the Co-op, Mr. Sutton, and the chairman of the committee, Mr. Foster, met with some of the watchmen at the Co-op to discuss the situation, and they left at around 10 p.m, leaving the committee men John Patterson, Christopher Carr and George Ather, along with the apprentice butcher John Cowell, in charge of the watch that night. The story at this point is told from the viewpoint of one of the witnesses, with the impression that they did not fully know who the burglar was, so he will mostly be referred to as the man for this small section. George Ather went into the office to take up position where he was clearly able to see the front door of the shop. The 3 other men stayed together in what was described as the mincing room. A little after 4 a.m, George noticed the street lights going down outside the store, and almost straight after this he heard the sound of a key turning in the lock of the shop door. The door opened and he saw a man walk inside carrying a large bright lamp. He appeared to have some kind of stick under his arm and was dressed in dark clothing, and he clearly had a beard. The man wandered around the inside of the shop for less than a minute and was heading towards where George was hiding. It was at this point that John Patterson and Christopher Carr came out of their hiding place and made a grab for the man. Cowell turned the shop lights up a little at the same time. The men then grabbed hold of the arms of the man, and while they were struggling with him, Christopher Carr claimed to have hit him at least twice on the back of the head with a butcher's steel. A butcher's steel is used to sharpen the butcher's knives. George claims to have said, "Don't badly use him." It was at this point that it was noticed that the lamp the man had been carrying was now lying on the shop floor, along with his hat and what now proved to be a false beard. It was also around this time that the man spoke, and George felt by the sound of his voice and his face now without the beard that the man in the shop was Joseph Noble, who he had known for many years. It was then noticed that the man had a revolver in his left hand. I feel I must point out that the drawing on screen is a copy from the news article as it appeared at the time. However, it shows a man with a revolver in his right hand, but the witnesses state it was in his left. This is not my mistake. I have copied exactly as it appeared in the newspapers at the time. It was Cowell who had noticed the revolver, and he shouted a warning to the others. They were at this point still struggling with the man, and it was then that the revolver went off, hitting John Patterson in the head, and he immediately fell to the ground. The revolver then went off again, and this time Christopher Carr was shot. He jumped to one side, stating that he had been shot in the leg. George Ather was by now the only person who still had hold of the man, and in the confusion of the shots going off, it seems he let him go. Cowell then went to the front door in an attempt to block his exit, as they assumed this would be the only way out. However, the man did not head this way, and George and his wife lived close to the store, shouted to the men that the burglar was breaking a window of the boiler house to make his escape. She was at the time standing outside in the street, having heard the commotion, so she was able to see what was happening. George Ather then went to get a hammer and went into Union Street, where he saw the man's legs coming out of the window. He struck at the man and hit him on the right leg below the knee. He then hit him again, and the man is said to have cried out, "Oh!" But somehow I doubt that was all he said after being hit with a hammer. However, the man was still able to get out of the window and began to run along Union Street, followed by George Ather's wife. It was said that she chased him with an axe, but he still managed to get away from her. And as she came back, George told her that John had been shot. They then went back into the shop and found John Patterson lying on the floor. It was also at this time that they found the skeleton keys in the door of the shop. The police were then called, and P.C. Thompson arrived. He immediately called for Inspector Lambert and the doctor. P.C. Thompson made a search of the area but was not able to find anything. Once it was daylight, he searched the area again. This time he found a footprint in the bottom of the tub of pig fat, which must have been caused when the man stood inside the tub as he was climbing out of the window. He was then able to trace footprints down towards the quarry and then towards White House Barns Farm, and it was here where the trail ended. The road from this area led towards the house in Stone Street where Joseph Noble lived, and the footprints seemed to be appearing in that direction, but the road here was bad and the footprints could not be seen properly or to be clearly seen heading to Joseph's actual front door. However, P.C. Thompson took some plaster casts of the footprints. For what reason, it doesn't seem particularly clear. Despite the footprints not leading to the door of Joseph Noble's home, they were fairly sure that he was their man, and they then proceeded to search his house for evidence. It was here that they found a lantern, a crowbar, a burglar's jemmy, a second set of skeleton keys, which apparently when tested fitted the doors of certain departments at the Windy Nook Co-Op, and a box of cartridges. They also found several new suits and new boots, 2 chests of drawers full of new drapery goods, and other items including a box of bars of soap were found under the bed, all marked with the name of the Cooperative Society. A lot of these items were later identified as having come from the Windy Nook store. They also found a coat outside in a tub of water. It was assumed that Joseph was attempting to remove the pig fat from this coat. And they found a pair of trousers which appeared to be torn in several places, which it was assumed could have been caused by climbing out of the broken window. On November the 4th, Joseph was examined by Dr. Robinson, who said he found wounds to the back of his head, which were recent, and also wounds to his legs, which he believed could have been caused by a hammer similar to that used by George Ather. They were now completely convinced that Joseph Noble was indeed the man they wanted, and with George Ather having said he recognised him on the night of the shooting, Joseph was quickly arrested for the murder of John Patterson. At the inquest, Dr. Patterson stated that the cause of death for John Patterson had been gunshot wounds to the head. He said he had still been alive, but he had died on his way to hospital and he had never regained consciousness and was therefore not able to identify the man who shot him. An unnamed witness is said to have seen Joseph Noble early one morning and that he was at the time wearing a fake beard. This witness said he had known Joseph for some time and thought the false beard to be a bit strange. Another witness from the London lamp manufacturers said that Joseph Noble had recently bought a lamp exactly like the one that had been found at the scene of the crime. It was only made by their company, so could only have been sold by them. Joseph protested his innocence, but the jury very quickly returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder, and Joseph Noble was committed for trial. The funeral of John Patterson took place a couple of days after the inquest. A service was held at the Ebenezer Chapel, which was somewhere that John had been connected to since his childhood. They then travelled to St Albans Church, where a further service was held before the burial in the churchyard took place. It was said that several thousand local residents and some from the surrounding areas of Felon, Gateshead and Newcastle attended the church ceremony, and that the roads to the church had been lined by many more people. Some of those present were managers and representatives of the Co-op stores, along with many family members. The gravesite, I believe, is unmarked as I was not able to find it, but the photo on screen at the moment is of St Albans Church and the churchyard in Windy Nook, where other members of the Patterson family are also buried. The trial of Joseph Noble took place in early March of 1908. Joseph pleaded not guilty. He still said he was innocent and that it was a case of mistaken identity. He was described at the time as being neatly dressed and in good spirits, and it was said that he followed the trial details very closely. The men who were present on the night that the crime took place stated that Joseph had shot both John Patterson and Mr. Carr deliberately, but in the commotion it would have been quite hard to tell if it had been deliberate or accidental. The defence certainly felt that a charge of manslaughter should be considered, suggesting that Joseph may have acted in self-defence as he felt his life was in danger as he was being attacked by the four men on watch that night, but this theory was refused. A letter was produced which was written by Joseph to the London Lamp Company asking about their night lamps. This was a recent letter and it was viewed as being proof that the lamp found in the shop had indeed been recently bought by Joseph simply for the purpose of breaking into the Co-op. It was suggested that while he gave the impression of being a simple working man, he was in fact an accomplished burglar. Joseph, when questioned, said he was not in the Co-op store on the night the incident took place. He said he kept dogs and ferrets for ratting and that he often went out shooting, which was why he had some guns in his house, but not a revolver. In fact, he claimed that he had never owned a revolver of his own, but that he did repair them for other people. He claimed the set of skeleton keys found in his home had come from his father, who had kept them in a chest, and when he died they had passed down to him. He also said he often had bacon for breakfast. This was actually in explanation for the grease on his coat. And he said the man who had seen him wearing a false beard was clearly mistaken. He also made it very clear that he was a right-handed man, and the man who was seen using the revolver in his left hand was clearly not him. He said that the wounds on his head had been caused at work when an iron bar had fallen on his head, and that the cuts on his trousers had been caused by sharp edges of iron that he had been working with, and the wounds or marks on his legs had also been caused, he claimed, by accidents at work. He seemed to have an answer for everything. However, he did not make any attempt to explain why he had so many goods in his home that had the cooperative labels on, or that many of the items had been identified as having come from the Windy Nook store, especially as he had stated that he did not shop there. When cross-examined about the skeleton keys, he claimed to know little or nothing about them, but that they had been in his home for many years and that he had never used them. He was also not aware that any had been added to the bunch by the police, as had been suggested. Some were said to be old, but others seemed to be relatively new and recently used. Other evidence given was similar to that which I have already mentioned from those present on the night that the shooting took place, with several witnesses telling their story of what happened, and most had told similar stories to each other. In the end, the trial came down to whether or not the jury believed that Joseph Noble had been the man in the co-op that night. Whilst he claimed he was not, there was evidence from at least one witness who claimed to have recognised him in the co-op that night. However, it seems that even he did not identify him conclusively on the night, but at the police station later he had claimed he was in no doubt that this was the man who had been in the co-op store on the night of the crime. There was also what was classed as the circumstantial evidence of the torn clothes and the wounds on his head and legs and the footprints leading in the direction of his home. Although a plaster cast of the footprints had been made, as I mentioned earlier, it seems they were never actually compared to the shoes or boots worn by Joseph, as they were not mentioned during the trial. The jury retired for some 45 minutes before returning to give their verdict of guilty of murder. Joseph was asked if he had anything to say as to why a sentence of death should not be passed on him, and he replied by saying, "I am innocent of the crime that I am charged with. I might say you can break my neck, but I don't think you will break my heart." The judge then passed sentence of death by hanging on Joseph Noble, and that his remains would be buried within the walls of Durham prison. Joseph appeared to show no emotion to this, and on leaving the dock it was said he appeared to be looking for someone in the gallery, and is said to have waved his hand before being removed back to Durham prison. As was usual with these cases, a petition was started with the aim for a reprieve for Joseph. It was said to have been extensively signed, but no details are given as to how many signatures had actually been added. The reprieve was not granted, and the execution would go ahead at 9 a.m. on the 24th of March 1908. It was said that during his time in prison, Joseph was quiet and calm and caused no trouble. He spent most of his time reading, and it was said that he slept and ate well, having gained weight during his time in prison. He was even said to have joked that he did not wish to wear his good suit for the execution, and that an older one would be better. His wife and daughter visited him, and when she was interviewed afterwards, she said that they had discussed family matters and details of the disposal of his goods after his death. And while she agreed that he seemed calm and resigned to his fate, she felt that he had lost weight and looked much thinner now. His sons also visited him with their uncle, and afterwards Joseph wrote a letter to the elder boy expressing his wish that they should continue to attend Sunday school and church. In his final letter to his wife, which she received on the day of the execution, he expressed his wish that those left behind would live happily together and be kind to each other, and that the remaining family, he hoped, would have a good life, and he also continued to claim that he was innocent. The newspapers carried a story shortly before the execution of the rope arriving in a red box, and that the scaffold had been tested and found to be working fine. There was a reason for this, which will be explained shortly. It was said on the night before the execution that Joseph did not sleep well. He went to bed sometime around midnight and was awake again by 2:30 a.m. He spent his last hours smoking and writing poetry. He was visited by the prison chaplain, the Reverend D. Rose, at around 7 a.m. and then had breakfast of bread and butter. The executioners were the Pierpont brothers. I have sometimes seen their name as Pierpont. Joseph was pinioned, which means his arms were tied at the wrists. It is said that he then told the executioners, "Don't hurt my neck." This was said to be another example of the grim humour he had displayed many times during his time in prison. A large crowd had gathered outside the prison walls, however there was nothing for them to see. Only the pressmen were allowed inside to be present for the execution. The crowds were said to be quite small though, only 200 to 300 people. Joseph is said to have walked with calmness but firmness, and he turned to face the waiting press and appeared interested in them being there, before turning his head again and continuing towards the scaffold. This was a double execution, and the other man present I will cover in another story at a later date, and this was also the reason for the scaffold being tested before use. They were said to be side by side on the scaffold, and when the ropes had been adjusted, at a little after 9 a.m. the bolt was pulled and Joseph fell. His death was said to be instant. The body would be left, as was the custom, for 1 hour before being removed. It is said that afterwards, during the inquest on the body of Joseph Noble, that the press were allowed to see him in his plain wooden coffin, though I have no idea why they would want to do this. Joseph was buried side by side with the other man executed with him that day in the exercise yard of Durham Prison. It was stated that afterwards the ground was very carefully rolled so that no trace could be seen of the newly dug graves. No markers were placed. The only way to locate the graves afterwards would be by the detailed map kept by the prison officials. I assume rolling the ground was done so that the other prisoners couldn't see where someone had been buried, but there would be no doubt that they would be aware of what was happening. Joseph Noble had paid a heavy price for his crime, but was he really guilty of murder? Was it a case of an accidental shooting during the struggle, or had he indeed planned to shoot anyone who tried to stop him escaping? Or was he even the man who was inside the Co-op store that night? I will leave that up to you to decide. It was stated sometime later, in around September of 1908, that the cooperative stores gave relief money to the value of £1 1 shilling to Mrs. Patterson, and oddly they also gave the same sum of £1 1 shilling to Mrs. Noble. £1 may not sound a lot, but in today's money that would have been over £150. It is not known what happened to Mrs. Noble and her children after the death of her husband. I hope you have enjoyed this sad and somewhat tragic story, which left 2 families without their fathers and 2 men without their lives, one perhaps for greed and the other to protect the cooperative stores from further thefts. If you have enjoyed this story, then please do give it a thumbs up, and please do subscribe to the channel if you would like to hear more stories like this one. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.